where there were pictures going around the world this week. I saw pictures of LA, I saw pictures of Sao Paulo and Beijing, and this is Milan and Delhi, and they were clean. And it was the cleanest air, I think, in the history of Los Angeles. So when was this? This is almost 4 years ago exactly, the second week of April. And it was a surprise. And now I don't want to suggest right now that the way to clean air is to shut down the global economy. That's not what I'm saying. But as someone who works in sustainability, we are often accused of painting doom and gloom pictures and showing how awful things could be. And I think sometimes we don't have the language or even the pictures to say, here's what we could build. Here's what we're doing. So I like to step way back and just remember, why are we doing this? And I will get into the business case for sustainability and all the value you can create and some of the details of how to build that kind of company that creates value for society that you heard about this morning. But it's good to remember why. So picture, we get to net zero in around 2050 in electricity, in vehicles, and I think we are headed there. I'm going to share some data on how fast things are moving, and I think we are going to get there. And over half the world's largest companies have net zero goals now. This is what our cities will be like, right? Right now, 8 million people die every year prematurely from air quality, and we just kind of accept that's part of doing business. It isn't. It won't be. And then I like to imagine that these cities also, the communities in the cities, the communities supporting them, the mining, the farming communities, the chemistry communities, the petrochemical, are actually living healthy, that those communities, the people are paid a living wage, that they have enough. This is the world we're trying to build together. It's a healthy, just, regenerative world. It's a better world, and we're heading there. Now, I get asked, for about 20 years I've been in this overlap of business and society, business and environment. I get asked very frequently, well, does sustainability pay? Doesn't it always cost more? I mean, I get asked this like literally daily. I do a lot of speaking, I do a lot of media interviews, and I have to talk about this all the time. And I'll say the short version is yes. Yes, it pays. And I'm going to kind of talk about that throughout my time with you. It's not as simple as that. Nothing pays immediately or obviously. Nothing in business is that simple. But yes, my first book, which came out almost 18 years ago now, my second son came out the same day that my first book did. And he's like this walking 6'3" lanky reminder of how long I've been doing this as he's becoming a young adult. And I have two, Gen Z boys, they are interesting as a generation. We'll talk about that. If anybody have teens and young 20s, I heard, yeah, no, everyone's like, yeah. It's tiring, I will admit, sometimes, but they're becoming young adults. So I came out with this first book with a co-author, and we laid out 4 big buckets of value creation. This is a pretty simplistic view of business, but it is really very logical. There's only so many ways we create value. We go to work every day, and we are doing things that either lower cost or lower risk, or we're building the upside. We're selling more, or we're building brand value, that very hard to measure thing that is actually the majority of the value of most companies now, the intangible value. Now, if you're not doing one of those 4 things, then you're treading water or maybe destroying value. But most of the time, we are doing one of those things. And if you take a sustainability view, a green lens, whatever you want to call it, you can find many examples of companies creating billions of value in each of these buckets. Some of the companies in this room, I am sure, have cut lots of waste, energy, water, and saved hundreds of millions, billions, some of the examples here. Companies that have managed risk. Companies with big food and ag supply chains are managing risk, or companies that have actually lost value because of risk mismanagement. Sometimes some things have gone wrong, and they've lost billions in value. And it shows the value of managing this. Or on the upside, there are companies that have put out, we heard this morning about Tesla, kind of pure plays, to companies like BASF, who I think is probably in the room, who years ago did a really cool analysis looking at their portfolio, and you heard about it a little bit this morning too, where they look at their portfolio and say which products are more sustainable, which products are going to be part of the future where people want more sustainable products and services, and we're going to sell more of those fundamentally, right? And then on the intangible side, you have companies that have measured just solely the value to their business of attracting and retaining talent because they do more sustainability work. These are companies' examples where they found the value is hundreds of millions of dollars. Because you can measure what it costs to replace someone. And if you don't have to, you save a lot of money. So yes, it pays. Now, sustainability is always treated like this add-on, but we've been through that before in business. I think this audience would appreciate this more than most. If you go search bad safety. Has anybody done this? There is just endless pictures of, this is not made up. There's a guy standing on a railing hanging a safety poster, but there's pictures of ladders on ladders, people holding people that are into pits, and there's 3 guys with a rope, like everything you can imagine. But safety was a thing that was added to business, right? It became a set of degrees and acronyms, and it took time. It took decades. 100 years ago, 120 years ago, there was child labor. And safety, OSHA, wasn't even a thought. We've added this to business, and I guarantee you, and I've seen this, there's data showing and examples of industry associations that were ticked off about this 100 years ago and said, this is going to cost too much, just like they say about sustainability. Same thing with the quality movement, right? This is I'm sure there's people here with TQM who have degrees in this, they have certifications. This was added to business to make it better. And nobody now would say, we don't want our products and our manufacturing to be safe or high quality. Nobody would say that. But I'm sure there were conversations decades ago about Six Sigma. I don't need 1 in a million to be wrong. That's way too much. We can have 5 or 6 be wrong every million. It'll be fine, right? We are in a very fast-changing time now. The world has been changing. In the last few years in particular, I've seen more change in what it means to be a business, what's expected of business, than in the 20 years I've been in this, easily. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The pandemic was clearly one of the reasons. And we saw companies doing things they had never really done before. They had to. I had one big client, industrial manufacturer, say, there were things we knew were going to happen maybe in our supply chains or over time that we thought we had years to do, and then we had weeks. And they figured it out. But one of my favorite examples was Medtronic. Medical device maker released the designs of portable ventilators so that the big car companies could manufacture ventilators because we didn't have enough. As a non-manufacturing guy, I don't fully understand how you make a car plant make ventilators, but that's up to the engineers, right? It seems like they're pretty different. But they did this. Now, was this short-term profit maximizing for Medtronic? Was this a thing you would do if you were going to go talk to your investors about what did we make this quarter? No. Was it the right thing? Yes. Was it both profitable? I mean, I think their stakeholders, their customers, and certainly their employees know what they did. And it was meaningful. It was a noble purpose, as you heard about this morning. So what I think has changed fundamentally is that now sustainability, it isn't just ESG, and we're getting lost now in so much of the reporting and the metrics, and we need all that. It shows the evolution of this field. But it is a larger story now. A company has to really talk about its role in society and who it serves. Who are you? What is your noble purpose? Who do you serve? Is it just shareholders? Is it something more? And the expectations of business now are global and broader. Surveys, Edelman and others that survey trust. Business has lowish trust, but it is higher than government. That's a low bar, but it is higher. And this has been found year after year in recent years. If you ask people, do you want your CEOs, do you want companies to speak out? They do. You'll hear angry voices, pundits, TV say, CEOs should stay quiet. That's not what people want. The vast majority want to hear you. As a CEO, as a business, where are you on climate? Where are you on discrimination and inequality? Where are you on the wealth gap and inequality? They want to hear it. And the other thing that happened in the last few years that was really kind of the final straw, I've been watching this space for a long time, looking at 15, 20 stakeholders, and there were a couple stakeholders that were lagging, and investors was one of them. But something changed. And you started to see investors come in now, and there's a lot of reason for this. I work with financial service companies. They feel pressure from their customers to have more ESG funds. All those things you're seeing are actual demand, right? So you started to see investors ask more questions, and the biggest, maybe most famous investor in the world is Larry Fink. He runs BlackRock. It is the biggest investor in the world. He has about 10 trillion under management. Now, he's been writing a letter every January to the CEOs of the world. Because BlackRock owns basically 2, 3, 4, 5% of every public company. They have that much money. And he's written an open letter saying, here's some priorities, I think. And for years, 5, 6, 7 years, it was about sustainability, ESG, climate. In the last year or two, he's gotten quieter about ESG. He took a lot of heat. But he kind of put this out right before the anti-kind of ESG movement got started, and I'll come back to that in a little bit, because if I didn't mention it during Q&A, I would definitely get questions about it. It's the most asked thing I get around the world is, what about this anti-ESG thing? And he's taken some heat, so he's stopped using the phrase ESG as much, but meanwhile they're still launching ESG funds and they have huge inflows. And there's a lot of press about when someone pulls money from them over ESG, and it might be a couple billion from a state fund, and they are 10 trillion. Now you guys are numbers people. 2 billion to 10 trillion is just not noticeable. So like their inflows are still huge. So he's careful about how he talks about it, but this is what he said a couple years ago. This is capitalism. Pleasing your stakeholders is what you do to create value. This is basically the same as my message. And so fundamentally, when I'm asked, does it pay? Yes, it pays to please your shareholders. They want to see your story on this. And we're now in a time, not just now, but we've really arguably been accelerating as a species, as an economy, since Industrial Revolution at exponential rates. When you see any chart of population, of economy, of emissions, of water use, they're all exponential, right? But it's more than that now. It's not just exponential, it's really complicated. The US military has this acronym VUCA. They also have FUBAR, which I won't tell you what that means, you probably know. VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. I mean, does that not perfectly describe the last 3 or 4 years in the world? Every year I'm like, how could something bigger or worse happen? And we keep getting there. And all I can tell you is we don't know what the black swans will be. They come. We now know they come. And companies have to be prepared. And there's two fundamental existential threats that, as I mentioned, Edelman shows people around the world want business to take part in solving. One is inequality. And it's not that there's rich and poor. There's always been rich and poor. And capitalism, that's part of what capitalism does. But what's changed is in the last 40 years in the Western world, all of the income and wealth has gone to the top 1%, or even the 0.1%, or the 3 guys who build their own spaceships. Like, it's all gone to the top. And what that's meant is that you have a middle and a lower income that have not seen any real wage gains, and they feel left behind. And it's destabilizing. It is actually destabilizing on our society. It hurts our ability to function as a society. And so companies are being asked to take part in this, and think about this. And there's income inequality, and it connects directly to race and gender inequality, which people feel more directly in their business as they talk about DEI and all these things that also, can seem contentious. There's a real reason for it. The data shows that, say, a Latino woman makes a lot less than a white male for the same job. This causes tension. This is not stable. It's not healthy. It's not thriving. So companies are asked to do something about this. And the inequality that we're talking about of these dimensions is the S. Right? And when we're talking about S, it's fundamentally these things, and that connects to human rights in the supply chain. It's all the same set of questions. Equality. Equality of opportunity, equality of outcomes. These are really tough questions. But of course, the biggest existential threat, and what I consider the final exam for humanity, is really climate change. I'm not going to talk about the science. I will just say that it is very, very serious, and it's very costly. So even if you want to just take the economic view, and I have an economics degree, I have an MBA, this is my view as well. If you want to look at the numbers, you can ask the big reinsurance companies. They're the ones that pay for extreme weather, and they know what's what. And so Swiss Re has said that if we don't manage carbon on the path we're on, we'll see a loss of 18 to 20% of GDP. There was just another study of almost the exact same numbers. I think they calculated 38 trillion of loss to the economy. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it is, but it also kind of sounds livable. We've had Great Depressions, and sometimes the economy shrinks. But I remind people that this kind of number is an average. It's their best estimate. There are places where GDP will go up, and are starting to go up, like Canada, Northern Russia, places where warmer means longer growing seasons, more tourism. It's better. I just saw an article this morning that beach resorts in Denmark, has anybody been to Denmark? You don't go for beach resorts usually. They're growing really fast because it's so hot in Spain, in Italy. This is changing the world. So there's places that gain from this. But for the most part, on average, we lose, and there's places that don't just lose 18%, they're talking about losing 100%. I grew up in South Florida. I don't believe there's a scenario right now where Miami exists in its current form in 30 or 40 years. There's no way. Not on the path we're on. So how do we manage that? How do we think about the ROI as a society when there's places that will be binary? They lose 100%. And it's weird that I have to say this out loud, but it is really hard to sell more stuff of whatever you sell when someone's underwater, right? it's weird that we have to have this conversation about climate, to be honest with you. It is so existential in so many parts of the world that become unlivable. So I get accused at the end of my talks often of being too positive, too optimistic. So you're probably not thinking that right now. And if I stopped here and said, let's take some questions, it would be just the saddest keynote you've ever had. But we are moving exponentially, and there's some problems that are still moving, but we're also at this point, and I think we got here quite a while ago, where the cost of inaction, what I'm describing, these trillions, is way more than the cost of action. Way more. And I still hear all the time from people who want to maybe go slower on climate action, if we do this decarbonization, it'll destroy the economy. And I'm sorry, it's just ludicrous. Like, it's just ludicrous. It's destroying economies to do nothing. And in fact, it isn't just that it's so expensive and dangerous, it's that the cost of action has dropped so dramatically. So for example, the cost of renewable energy, this is data from Lazard, a bank, this isn't from Greenpeace. And people debate these numbers, but fundamentally, you go talk to a utility. I've talked to the CEO of the largest utility in the country and said, hey, you're heading to renewables. I just keep telling people on stage it's because it's cheaper. Is that right? And he's like, yeah, that was the whole conversation. Like, that was it. It is cheaper. It is fundamentally cheaper to build renewable energy now. Now, the last couple of years, we've seen this weird uptick for the first time in 20 years in renewables, but also in everything else, and that's inflation, that's supply chain problems, it's ripples from the pandemic. But fundamentally, it's still cheaper. And this is where we're headed, and this is why it pays to move to renewable energy, and it's why you're seeing exponential growth in corporate purchases of renewables. This is not utilities. This is companies buying renewables either on-site or down the road for their business, and it is growing exponentially. And these are big numbers now, right? You're talking about 40 gigawatts. A gigawatt's like a big nuclear plant. These are big numbers now. We're also seeing an exponential reduction in the cost of batteries and storage. You can see there was a little uptick in 22, and then it started going down again. And while those numbers, because it started so high, 22 to 23 is actually a pretty significant percentage reduction if you look really closely. It's getting cheaper and cheaper. The scale of the battery industry is really growing. And this is why you're seeing an exponential growth in cars. It's not just that everyone wants EVs, they're just getting cheaper. They're getting cheaper to produce, and we're seeing this exponential rise. In 2022, total car sales globally actually went down, and EVs and hybrids actually went up exponentially. They still rose exponentially. Why? Well, it's happening everywhere, and there's some stories you'll see now about the US. It's really weird what happens in the news. They're talking about a slowdown in EVs here because we may only grow 30% instead of 40 or 50%. I don't know in any business that that's a slowdown. If you went into your CEO and said, here's my plan, we're going to grow 30% next year, and they said, get out. That's not 50%. So we're still growing, but it's also largely, in major part by China. They are investing a lot. They went from 3-4% of new vehicle sales being EVs or hybrid just a few years ago to 36-7%, and they're growing really fast. And this led to one of the headlines that kind of went by that most people didn't see last year that to me was monumentally important. Sinopec, which is the national oil company of China, said out loud, we think we are at peak oil demand. I've said peak oil and people go, oh no, we've said that before. I'm like, no, that's peak supply. We know we don't have peak supply. We keep finding more and more. This is peak demand. This is like you heard this morning about there was a point of peak demand of carriages before cars, right? And it doesn't mean when you look around you that everything is instantly green. All those numbers I've shown you on renewables and cars, it takes a while to change an infrastructure that's 100 years in the building, but we've passed the tipping point. And there's actually indications from the International Energy Agency that China might hit peak emissions for its economy this year. It's possible. I don't know, they're close. Now, there's some of that because they're slowing down in growth as well, but it's also been this massive commitment. It's not just cars. They've been putting EV buses on the road for years. They've been building renewables. They built the whole industry. They make almost all of the renewables, and they manage most of the metals, as probably some of you know in your business and in your value chains, that go into the clean economy. So exponential change happening, exponential opportunities, but companies are also under tremendous pressure from a series of stakeholders and a couple key megatrends. And one is just business-to-business pressure. This has been evolving for years and years. I've been studying this for 20 years, but clearly, and I hear it from people just anecdotally, even in the conversations in this room, about what are your customers asking? Why do you have to put together those safety data sheets? Why do they want to see your LCAs? But it's easy to point out companies asking for more data and kind of putting pressure on business. I like to find the ones that are not just the stick, but the carrot. And so I love this story from Tesco, the European retailer, and Santander, the bank, that Santander now offers to Tesco suppliers, the ones that are hitting really good ESG metrics, hitting science-based targets on carbon, they give them lower lending costs, lower operating costs for capital. And HSBC and Walmart are doing the same. So this is kind of becoming something that's an advantage. It pays to show your big customers that you are providing a smaller footprint product.